Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment, we introduced silent communication, which is part of horizontal thinking on the scale of intelligence, or the R scale. In this segment, we will discuss another type of communication within horizontal thinking. The communication type that we will discuss is referred to as intimate communication. In the previous segments, we talked about impulse, which refers to recognizing an environment. Then we discussed silent communication, which deals with using those experiences to create unique high-energy responses without regard to the environment or other people. Intimate communication is a somewhat more dynamic set of process, as they are meant to be experienced between two individuals. That is, exactly one individual with exactly one other individual. There is the requirement that each of the individuals obtain the appropriate and necessary level of psychological activation in order for this to occur. The requirement that each individual has obtained sufficient silent communication to the point of choosing to advance to intimate communication is marked by the fourth characteristic of communication. This characteristic is referred to as the intimate interaction. This is the understanding that an individual has obtained enough self-interaction and self-understanding to prioritize increasing psychological activation in a way that allows that level of activation to be communicated to exactly one other individual. In intimate communication, each of the individuals must be able to secure this level of activation prior to communicating in a constructive sense. Otherwise, the level of psychological activation would not be adequate to facilitate the higher order, high-energy functioning experienced in intimate communication. As mentioned in a previous segment, the purpose or goal of all psychological activation and communication is to communicate the experience of that activation with others. In intimacy, the interpretation and communication of that experience is a dynamic process. This process involves exchanging or reciprocating the levels of psychological activation associated with these levels of processing. These are referred to as the fifth and sixth characteristics of communication. The fifth characteristic is referred to as intimate identity. The sixth characteristic is referred to as intimate orientation. The intimate orientation can be considered to be the maximum psychological activation that a person can experience intelligently. The standard theory of psychology reinforces this explanation in a few different ways using math and geometry, but that will not be discussed here. The amount of activation being processed in the sixth characteristic, though, will lead to a sort of overload event in the brain. In this event, the level of activation exceeds the threshold of the brain structures. This overload, according to standard theory, will be marked by the release or transmission of a neurotransmitter, namely dopamine or oxytocin. The release of these chemicals becomes associated with the overload response of the sixth characteristic. From there, the interpretation of that event will be determined by the fifth characteristic, or intimate identity. The intimate identity is related to whether or not that overload event was marked by a physical release of a neurotransmitter. In intimate identity, there is a chance that the overload event was not associated with physical neurotransmitter release. There are several reasons that this might happen, such as an overload event that happens out of order or in a way that does not follow lowest to highest activation. The lack of release during overload can be associated with lack of resource or lack of availability of neurotransmitter in the brain. This can also be caused by medication, toxins, chemicals, environmental factors, among other things. Furthermore, the release of neurotransmitter or other molecules might occur without an overload event, especially in medication and substance abuse. For these reasons, the overload event and the interpretation of the overload event are seen as separate characteristics, the sixth characteristic referring to the set of events that are associated with the overload event and the fifth characteristic referring to the result or interpretation of that event. The sum of positive and negative interpretations of these processes is likened to the personality of a person. According to standard theory, the personality is related to the interpretations of overload situations based on whether or not there was an associated release of transmitter. The sixth characteristic is related to an overall, maximum understanding of the entirety of intelligence and the sum of meaningful experiences in relation to real-time, new experience. The fifth characteristic, or personality, is related to the outcome of each of those events. In constructive intimacy, both individuals will experience their individual orientations or ability to communicate. From there, one individual will experience either a new overload event known as a sixth characteristic, or will communicate the result of a previous overload event, known as a fifth characteristic. From there, the other person will reciprocate that process by returning a result from the other person's overload event or by experiencing an overload event related to the other person's previous response. This exchange of intimate identity and intimate orientation between exactly two individuals is the goal of all psychological communication. This process will continue for a limited amount of time, though, as, eventually, something will disrupt this process. A physical response, An environmental factor or the lack of an identity or orientation will lead to the breakdown of this reciprocation cycle. Furthermore, there are only a specific number of times that the brain can process this type of communication. From there, some amount of deactivation will have to occur, which we will not discuss now. Instead, we will explore the third communication within horizontal thinking. Please join me in the next segment to discuss social communication.